Coordinate media law and ethics in the journalism department here at UTS. I've also been a journalist for over 30 years, working in Australia and on Fleet Street. We've got 6 great guests online today, and we thank them very much for attending, especially those in different time zones. Zahera is up at 4 a.m. in London. Rawen, I think it's 7 a.m. where she is in Jordan. We really greatly appreciate your time. Thanks also to everyone tuning in today. I'd also like to note, we additionally reached out to a number of Australian news organisations, big and small, representing different perspectives, who either didn't respond to us or weren't able to join the discussion today. I don't infer anything by saying this other than that we've cast around, and we will try to address today a few of those different perspectives. And in discussing the media's responsibilities in its reporting, we're very much talking about the mainstream media. And this is not meant to be a discussion of how community news organisations report that have very specific demographics and understandably, report in certain ways. We're seeing huge protests around the world in response to what is happening in Gaza at the moment. 500,000 in London 2 weeks ago, 50,000 in Sydney. Last week, there were 300,000 on the streets in Washington. It's the reaction of a public moved, like it rarely is, by a real sense of urgency. And protests of this kind usually only occur when governments aren't listening, and also to an extent when the media isn't either. If you look at the mainstream media today and its response to Gaza, we don't see that urgency reflected in the headlines or the front pages. For over 4 weeks, water, electricity, fuel, and food have been cut to all the people of Gaza, but the editorials of our major newspapers deny that this is collective punishment, let alone a possible genocide in the making. Terms like segregation or ethnic cleansing are also, it seems, off limits. Even mentions of the occupation of the West Bank or the historic blockade of Gaza are scarce. The public, of course, no longer just has books and newspapers to rely on for information. They can Google the definition of collective punishment, compare it with what they're seeing, and scratch their heads and wonder how it doesn't apply. They can scroll through their social media accounts and view the videos of carnage that the newspapers haven't chosen to show or the broadcasters to air. So, has the mainstream media reported fairly and accurately on the Palestinian situation? Or could it be guilty of double standards and of omitting crucial context? Does it use different language to describe Israelis and Palestinians, or give greater prominence to one side's stories than the others, thereby conditioning the response of the public? Perhaps more significantly, has its reporting, both today and over decades, enabled this status quo and reduced the chance of finding a solution? And while there is a huge and urgent concern right now for the fate of Gazans, there is also a very real, constant fear among many Jews of an existential threat to them that is ingrained in them and born of centuries of anti-Semitism. This in itself is a complicating, intangible factor, and also part of the reason some Jewish journalists we reached out to didn't feel comfortable appearing on this panel today. We often hear that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is complicated, which can be a convenient get out for the media not to stay on top of it when the fighting ends. However, the current conflict is indeed more complicated than usual, both for the violence of Hamas's October 7 assault and for the impact of the most right-wing government Israel has seen in decades, which has emboldened settler violence, and before the war, had Israelis protesting vehemently on the streets. Lastly, before we move on to the speakers, we will ask if the media, which historically is one of the least trusted sectors, is being outflanked by social media. Are the public better able to critically question the information they receive on social media, and going forward, might they choose it over more traditional sources? So anyway, let's get on with it. As James said, the audience can post questions in the Q&A, which James will moderate. Because we do have a lot of speakers and also want the audience to be able to have their questions answered, I'll interject if speakers are going over time. We'll hear from Rawen, Zahera, and Karen first, and then take some questions, and then hear from our other 3 guests. So with no further ado, our first speaker, Rawen Damen, from the NGO Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, has worked as a senior commissioning producer at Al Jazeera for 10 years, and also founded and led the Palestine Remix Project, the largest visual interactive website focusing on Palestine. She has produced and directed more than 30 hours of TV documentaries that have been translated into multiple languages, including the award-winning documentary series Al Nakba, which documents the mass displacement of Palestinians during the founding of Israel. Rawen, welcome to UTS, and thank you for being with us today. What are your observations of the media's coverage of the current conflict?
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm honored to be with the colleagues, panelists from all over. I think it's the first time I'm talking live to Australian participants. I've been in webinars for other continents, but I'm very glad that we are talking together. I've been a filmmaker, as you mentioned. Al Nakba documentary has been screened in Australia, several countries. I did it 15 years ago, and it's translated to multiple different languages. As I'm speaking today, we have colleagues for ARIJ, Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. We have been an organization training investigative journalists and fact-checkers in all Arab countries. And during the last 15 years, we trained hundreds of Palestinian journalists. In the last 5 years, we trained 250 in Gaza Strip. And 17 of them did investigations with us, which means that we spent months coaching them to produce investigation. This means they became very close colleagues. So I'm speaking, and those journalists and fact-checkers, we have also friends and relatives in Gaza Strip. So the first we are asking is to stop and have an immediate ceasefire, because what's happening is really unbearable and unbelievable. It's a political turning point, but it's also a media turning point with all what happened with the mainstream media. For the last month, colleagues in the Arab world, in Middle East and North Africa, to a great extent, lost trust with the main media stream, especially in English language, coming from different places. And that never happened before. I mean, we have been seeing conflicts in the region for a long time. And this is a 100-year story. And we have seen what's happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, but never happened what happened this time. I'm focusing, and let me share my screen and try to make this like a presentation. So I hope that all of you can see my full screen. I'm focusing today on misdisinformation, as other speakers will be handling more the general scope of the media. So the Arab Reporters of Investigative Journalism, just to make sure people understand, we are based in Amman, Jordan, from where I'm speaking, and we have part of ARIJ, the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, the Arab Fact Checkers Network, AFCN. We started this with pre-publication fact checkers who helped us with all our investigations. We were part of all ICIJ projects, so Panama Papers, Paradise Fence, and Pandora. But slowly after Trump 2016 and the misdisinformation, malinformation climax, many of those pre-publication fact-checkers became working in post-publication fact-checking and initiated different organizations, initiatives. So under this umbrella of Arab Fact Checkers Network, we have now around 38 different organizations, initiatives, and around 250 fact checkers from the region. So when all of this, we found that we cannot, of course, access Gaza Strip. Nothing can enter there. We cannot get any of our people out. So we decided maybe it's our time to try to support and collaborate and cooperate with international fact checkers. So we reached out to IFCN, the International Fact Checkers Network, and they have a lot of fact checkers there. And we opened a Slack group that we can support them with fact checking. So what I'm having examples in this presentation is mainly what happened during the last 30 days. I'm having 10 different examples. So we had one allegation that came out widely of Hamas using Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza as a military base. So the Israeli military claimed that Hamas uses Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza as base for military operation, including underground headquarters and a tunnel system. This is not an old thing. Only 2 days ago, on Al Arabiya TV, which is in Arabic language, the analyst said that on air. So still this allegation is going on, and images were presented by Israeli military spokesman who alleged that the medical complex housed areas used for launching rockets and storing weapons. So we checked that with our fact-checking organizations in the region and proved using satellite images and images from within the hospital that the alleged Hamas sites beneath the hospital correspond to health facilities above ground. Also, of course, Mads Gilbert, the Norwegian doctor, have been there many, many times, and he gave a witness into this. The second allegation that was titled Palestinians in Gaza faking their death scenes. Many media organizations, English-speaking, Israeli influencers on social media and the IDF. So I think we should be speaking about mainstream media, but also this content is taking its place on the social media, publish videos, pictures claiming that Palestinians in Gaza are faking their deaths and injuries by Israeli missiles. And so this led to really dehumanizing of Palestinians and spread of more hate speech against Palestinians. And so Logically Fact, and English-speaking fact checkers, and several Arab and international fact checkers organizations, all of them debunked these claims in several investigations. There was a video showing the making of a student film in Egypt that was used as presented the Palestinians. There was also an old video filmed here in Amman, Jordan, was shared as an evidence. There was a clip from 2017 that was mispresented as footage of Palestinians being taught how to fake injuries. The third allegation is about the white phosphorus that is not being used in bombing Gaza and Lebanon. And let's really make sure that all the audience understand that what's happening in Gaza Strip is unbelievable, but also it's ongoing in the occupied West Bank and in Lebanon as well. There was also one journalist that was killed in southern Lebanon, and over 40 journalists who were killed in Palestine so far. The Israeli foreign ministers claim that Israel did not use the white phosphorus in Gaza and southern Lebanon in October 2023. Of course, this has been used before in 2014 in Gaza. This claim was also widely spread on social media and published by many, many media organizations from the mainstream media outlets. So we are supporting 3 Palestinian fact-checking organizations, very small ones, but they collaborated very well with international and Arab fact-checking organizations and debunked these claims, proving by live footage from Gaza and from Lebanon, in addition to interviews with doctors and on-ground sources in Gaza, Palestine, that prohibited white phosphorus was used several times during the ongoing crisis. The fourth allegation is the widespread image of the Swedish activist Greta, who was being associated with advocating harm to Jews and being linked to ISIS. Her pictures were manipulated and widely used on social media, and it was very, very easy these days to debunk those images and see how the words that she has been using have been fabricated and lies. There is the allegation from President Biden appearing in a video to announce a military draft in support of Israel against Hamas. And also the AI has been used widely during the last month. Of course, it has been widely used in the last 2-3 years, but this time it has been really with deep fake reaching American President Biden. So the AFP fact-checked this video, which appears to be fabricated using the clip that appeared on December 7, 2021. And of course, many clues gave this, the president tie and gestures as well as the background and the camera angles all appear to match the audio that was fabricated. There is also with the AI, the full image is an AI-generated image, and this picture was spread virally on social media, claiming that it shows a tent of camp in Eilat inside Israel, built by the Israeli government to house displaced citizens, Israelis during the war, and the whole image is an AI image. There's also very widely, and the main media took this, Hamas beheaded 40 Israeli children. So this was taken by CNN, by Fox News, by the New York Post, Israeli officials, including the Prime Minister office, actors, social media influencers with large followers use this. And there has been nothing that proved this claim is accurate. Some media organizations like the CNN apologized later for spreading this claim. And the CNN anchor said that yesterday the Israeli Prime Minister office said it had confirmed Hamas beheaded babies and children while we were live on the air. The Israeli government now says today it cannot confirm babies were beheaded. I needed this, what Sarah Sidner says, to be more careful with my words, and I'm sorry. The eighth allegation is also connected to Hamas putting Israeli children in cages. This video, for example, in one post had 2 million views within hours, and it was claiming that young Israeli children has been taken hostage by Hamas and held in animal cages. The video was very, very disturbing, and it was proved later that it was taken and posted on October 4th, so 3 days before anything happened, on TikTok, and it was removed by TikTok. And until now, we cannot verify from where this video came and what it is connected to. Also, Hamas destroyed the Baptist church in Gaza. This was a big allegation, a video shared widely, claiming also users that it shows a Baptist church in Gaza being attacked by Hamas. And this video was verified that it is from Philippines in 2017 when ISIS destroyed the Catholic church and later put it on fire. And the last is people taking part in UK marches in support of Palestine as described as pro-Hamas. And this came from the BBC, that the BBC presenter said when commenting on this, describing them as backing Hamas. The BBC later admitted that it misled people, and it said, earlier on BBC News, we reported on some of the pro-Palestinian demonstration at the weekend. We spoke about several demonstrations across Britain during which people voiced their backing for Hamas. We accept that this was poorly phrased and was a misleading description of the pro-Palestinian demonstration, and this came from the chief presenter that said it live on BBC World News. We are having our ARIJ annual forum. It's our 16th annual forum. We are doing it from December 1st to 3rd. We'll be speaking more about misdisinformation and investigative journalism in the region. It's a hybrid full translation into English and sign language, and it's free. So if people who are listening to us can tune in to en.arij.net and register to attend virtually, online, that would be great. And I'm so excited that we will announce in this forum our new chairperson, Dr. Zahera Harb, who's speaking next from London. And it's our pleasure to have her as our chairperson starting December 2023. This is my email if you need more information about what we are doing, or if you have fact checkers who would like to support this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rawen. That's great. The people who are posting questions, we will get to those shortly. We're just going to hear from a couple of other people first. So I'd like to introduce Zahera Harb next. Zahera is from the Department of Journalism at City University of London, where she leads the International Journalism Cluster. Zahera has more than 11 years' experience as a journalist in her native country, Lebanon, working for Lebanese and international media organizations that include CNN and Dutch TV. Zahera's current work examines the coverage of Middle East conflict in Western media, She's particularly focused on journalism practices, the role of ethics in situations of stress, and the responsibilities of journalists in those situations. She has also researched how reporting can harm those it reports on, and that journalists need knowledge of history as well as skills, or their reporting can become distorted. Zahera, I feel like your field of study would make you particularly sensitive to the coverage over the past 4 weeks. What have you made of it?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you, Rawan, because she really set the scene for my intervention in this forum. Let me start by saying that research has informed us about the systematic power of the Israeli public relation doctrine in comparison to any on the Palestinian side, if we can say there is any on the Palestinian side. Most prominent studies were 2 studies conducted by Glasgow Media Unit, led by Greg Philo and Mike Berry. Hence the dominance of what I call the Israeli narrative in mainstream, and mainly I'm focusing on the British media here, which might also reflect some of the practices on the American screens during this current war. So this dominance of the Israeli narrative actually does not come as a surprise for many of us who has been looking at how mainstream media has been covering the Palestinian-Israeli conflict over the years. We also know from academic research that and also from scholars who contributed to my book on reporting the Middle East, that history, semantics, and context are essential components of any coverage of the 56 years of Israeli military occupation of the Gaza Strip and West Bank, including Jerusalem. Ignore the history and the context, and the coverage is bound to be one-sided. So the current coverage of the war on Gaza, or covering Gaza, is no different. We have seen many of the British media coverage, and I purposefully is avoiding generalization, because we've also seen some attempts by many journalists to actually stand up and produce coverage that could be seen as balancing the scene. But what we've seen with many of the British coverage is that it's actually falling short on getting the semantics right and on ignoring history and context of the conflict. So Palestinians have been bombarded, killed in their thousands. Images and videos of their suffering are standing as eyewitness. Despite that, one of the examples that I also documented in a recent article that I published is, one news presenter was standing interviewing an Israeli government advisor, and the government advisor looked in the eye at the presenter and said to him, you cannot trust their numbers, that. And the news presenter did not agree or disagree, but not challenging what the narrative that has been directed at the presenter could actually be seen as an indication of agreement. So the UN said they trust the numbers. The Palestinian Authority said these are their numbers too. And still, international agencies, also international aid agencies, said these numbers are correct. But the Israeli government is saying otherwise. And it is a cause to pause, as I say, and to start questioning the numbers of Palestinian victims for many British media organizations. Some newspapers, I have been told from inside sources, are actually rushing to publish information from Israeli sources without any process of verification. So I'm so glad what Rawan has showed us, because that's the right thing, the right way to do it. And this explains the rush, as Rawan mentioned, to publish those headlines about the beheading 40 Israeli babies without any confirmation or verification. I'm aware of the difficulty of verifying certain informations in times of war and conflict. I've reported on South Lebanon during the 90s. But when that is the case, it is journalists' responsibility to attribute information to their sources and not present them as facts. It's journalists' responsibilities to tell readers and viewers that the information they are presenting cannot be independently verified if that is actually the case. By not verifying and attributing sources, accuracy and truth are at stake. So verifying and attributing information to their sources need to be applied to both sides and not just to the Palestinians as it's currently standing. Journalists and media organizations have the duty of not inciting hatred against a group of people on the basis of their national identity or religion, among other factors. So inciting hate that might lead to serious harm against Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and Jews is at the core of this message. And actually, it's in the UK, it's part of the regulation rules. Many instances of hate speech towards Arabs and Palestinians have been recorded in the current coverage. Those hate messages were presented by Israeli officials like human animals without any pushback from presenters. Message that tended to incite hate, to harm against Palestinians as a collective of people and aiming at dehumanizing them. Rawan just mentioned one example where marches, pro-Palestinian marches calling for ceasefire were actually depicted on the BBC as pro-Hamas, which later apologized for. But all of this, and also the idea that, the use of Hamas and Palestinians interchangeably without being challenged. So these two terms were used without actually differentiating between the two. All of this, as also Rawan has mentioned, has tainted the reputation of impartiality. It was tainted of the BBC, tainted negatively among many of its audiences, including Arab audiences. It's no a secret that there's now memes on Arab social media equating BBC with liars. There's one very famous one that kept circulating over and over and over, and it says something like, "Don't lie, otherwise you will grow up and become a BBC correspondent." So these kind of memes have been really, reflecting how viewers in the Arab region and also Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims in the UK started relating to the fact that the BBC is not representing the crisis correctly. And also one of the reasons why that kind of like loss of trust with the main public broadcaster in the country has to do also with the coverage of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So as I said, on the first Saturday, they called them, where there was like 300,000 people protesting, marching, they called them pro-Hamas, then apologized. But then the week when we had the largest demonstration, which Martin referred to, and that was almost 500,000 people on the streets calling for a ceasefire. The BBC lead for the story forget the fact that they didn't actually cover the demonstration. Streets of London were pouring with people, and we didn't see live coverage on the 24 news channel. But then when they did actually do a story, they did a package, and the lead for the package said, let me read, "More than 1,000 Metropolitan Police officers were deployed across the capital to keep order as people protested against attacks on Gaza." So the focus was mainly on the keeping order, on the police, on the money, taxpayers' money being spent on policing those marches, rather than actually talking about the fact that all these people went on the street because they are asking for an immediate ceasefire. The reason why I'm not generalizing, because we have another example of how actually we can do things differently on a major public service broadcaster in this country, Channel 4, which has been trying to do actually a better job than the BBC. And their lead was, and again, I'm quoting, "For 3 weeks, Israel has attacked Gaza by air and now land. And for 3 Saturdays in a row, people have marched in their thousands in London to support the Palestinian people and call for an end to the war." So you can really do it properly. You can give prominence to the story itself rather than actually depicting it by relating those people on the streets, half a million, saying that they are wasting they're wasting taxpayers' money. As I said in the article that I recently published, time is repeating itself. The coverage of the Iraq War 2003 showed similar pattern, mainly in relation to the BBC. And I also say that the audiences were right then by feeling that they were let down by their public broadcaster, and the BBC at that time stood wrong. The BBC News CEO, Deborah Turnus, have said in a recent couple of weeks ago a statement that the BBC will be looking carefully at its Israel-Gaza coverage. But and that for them, she said, it's not good enough for the BBC to say if both sides are criticizing us, we're getting things right. She actually made a reference to the fact that they need to be sure on attributing information to its sources, and they also need to be careful about using semantics. So that is a good step in the right direction, but as I said before, it's not enough. It's not good enough to use the word massacre, and rightly so, in relation to the 7th of October attack, while using less indicative word like suffering when it comes to the horror Israeli military power is inflicting on the civilians in Gaza. Semantics do matter. So when we say Hamas attack is an assault versus on the other side, Israeli army bombardment and airstrikes. So using powerful descriptive language on one side and then going to use neutral one on the other. That does not make the coverage balanced coverage. Many have stepped away from watching the BBC, seeking information from other channels, including Al Jazeera. The one channel that again reports have suggested that the US Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken has asked Qatar to help with lowering the tone of its coverage, which again takes us back to 2003, Iraq War. But that actually was because, there was a huge, setback on these type of reports. The Foreign Secretary Office in the United States, the State Department denied this later. Journalists and media organizations, and I'm going to end with this, should not be afraid to stand up against hate and acts that amounts to genocide. Wherever that hate or actions are coming from, they should not allow any government or group to pressure them into their own PR narrative. Some, as I said, are standing up to it, but they are very few. Governments at war should not be blindly trusted. They say truth is the first casualty in wars. That should not be the case in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahera. I thought it was very interesting, a couple of things you said there about the protests in the UK. One of the features that we've seen of coverage of protests here in Sydney has been very similar in that what is often commented on is crowd control rather than the numbers of people protesting or even what the issues they're protesting are. I think it's also important to point out when you're talking about fact-checking around things like the allegation of beheading of children. Some people would ask, well, what does it make any difference how somebody died? I mean, I think that in terms of the use of this language, it's really specifically designed to demonize Palestinians, and we've also seen this with comparisons to ISIS. We've seen it in terms of Joe Biden comparing Hamas's attack to 9/11. So they're very deliberate uses of language in those situations. Now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Karen Percy. Karen, thank you for being with us. Karen's the head of the she's the Federal Media President of the MEAA, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, which represents about 5,000 journalists and media workers in Australia. The MEAA has also put out a statement this week, protesting the number of deaths of journalists in Gaza, which is now well over 30. Karen, what are your thoughts on what's happening at the moment, and what feedback are you getting from your members?
There are a lot of issues, and firstly, I want to say to Rawen and to Zahera, fabulous presentations, and I also want to particularly say to Rawen that I'm sorry for the loss of her colleagues, friends, families, and the like for what is going on. It's a really devastating issue, and thanks Zahera for really laying some terrific groundwork there from a different perspective. I think. There are lots and lots of problems that have been exposed in the Australian media sector as a result of this this conflict, whatever you'd like to call it. Lack of international journalists on the ground in Gaza for Australian news organisations. It's part of a broader contraction of covering the international coverage more generally. So we don't have the same connections in key places that we do. There's a lack of understanding, I think, in a lot of the places that we're trying to cover, and we don't have able to understand on the ground, or we're having to do it through other avenues. War zones are extremely hard. They're very, very dangerous places physically. Death, injury are very possible for everybody. Lack of food, lack of water, medical treatment and the like. These are very difficult environments for news organisations to send their people into, even if they could, and if the lack of communications means there's no guarantee you're going to get your work out. So there are very big challenges for news organisations in trying to determine how they're going to cover it. I was a correspondent in Southeast Asia back between 2006 and 2009, and then spent time in Russia in the 3 years after that. And so I'm very pleased to see that there's more caution by news organisations who are looking at the safety of their people and what they can guarantee and what they can't. But of course, this leaves a very, very big void. And we know that there are great local journalists, but when you haven't had that depth of coverage, you haven't had that ongoing connections, that becomes a bit fraught as well. It can be harder to verify information. Can you trust the people that you're working with? Do you know them? How are you able to get your material out? Are they free and able to report independently? A whole lot of very big questions about how you actually make this kind of coverage. And of course, it's very, very dangerous for those locals as well. So I think it's important that we understand the constraints and the difficulties of covering such a thing as this, such a conflict as this. We're also seeing another really big challenge for our industry. We've had COVID, we've had the Russian war, fires, floods locally. We've got a journalistic community that is exhausted. We've got a journalistic community that is distressed and feeling hopeless that so much of the reporting that they did within COVID and fires and floods just have made so little difference. So I think understanding where our industry is at the moment. Most of us haven't seen anything like this, of this scale, of this brazenness in our careers. And we're seeing years of redundancy. So we've got a much younger profession than we had to. We don't necessarily have the corporate knowledge, the history, etc. And we do have editors who are very, very scared of any kind of backlash, of any kind of criticism, be it political or from other lobby groups. So we've had a decimation of workers' rights, including journalists. It's very, very hard for journalists to stand up and say something in their newsrooms when there aren't the number of people around them that there used to be. They don't have the seniority that they used to have. A lot of them are in precarious work scenarios. So saying something actually does potentially mean a job loss. It's fabulous to have seen the ABC stand up. A leak of their major meeting this week notwithstanding, it's incredibly important that journalists be having these conversations, asking these questions. And I know a lot of journalists are. There are very many conversations happening in very many places about exactly this, whether it's about language, the fairness of the coverage and the like. So there is a great deal of discussion going on. I would also point to some broader issues about, overwork and the kind of pressures that journalists are under more generally, and how thin-skinned the average senior editor is these days, or media owner or editing, managing editor is about any kind of backlash or feedback they get from their staff. You know, so there are internal pressures as well. You've got the click rates, you've got, you know, engagement rates, etc., that as part of that whole kind of disruption to the business model. So there are very many moving pieces about how much pressure and difficult it is for journalists at the moment. I'm not trying to make excuses, but I'm trying to give an explanation of the landscape that is the reality of most journalists these days. I think there's also a real issue with Australia when it comes to the tyranny of distance. You know, we are very far from, you know, a lot of the other discussions where you see in Europe and the US and South America and other places where there's real discussion about our craft. While we are connected internationally in lots of ways, we still, I think, have quite an insular way of looking at our industry. We're not as attuned to practices abroad, for example. You know, you've seen in some big international publications, there'll be that open source intelligence kinds of editors where there's a real proactive push to ensure that whatever information is out there is actually correct. I was recently back in Oxford University for a Reuters Journalism Fellowship reunion. And, you know, it was really amazing to listen to so many brilliant journalists who really, from different parts of the world, who have a really good understanding of the craft and the challenges that we're facing, and we're able to discuss it. I think that's something we probably don't do as well here. But I spoke to Mariana Druk. She's from Radio Liberty, the head of the Ukrainian service there. And one thing she pointed out about the kind of international coverage more generally, particularly in the context of the Ukraine war, is that, you know, foreign journalists go to Ukraine with a framework, if you like, or a prism of Russian coverage, because they're either based in Moscow or that's where the dominant media is. So they've found that there are real issues within Ukraine of foreign journalists coming in and having a Russian narrative. So there's those kinds of things we need to be thinking about. And I don't think we do that enough as an organisation more generally. Saleh Al-Batadi was a Yemeni freelancer who also spoke at this reunion and talked about the lack of regard by big international news agencies for local producers, freelance producers and the like. And I think that's something we really need to be mindful of as well, that we don't actually look after international freelance staff very well at all. I think one of the areas that I would also like to, and this is something that was very much, you know, in contrast or brought to focus by Rawen, was the media versus social media, and people not really being able to understand what's social media and what's being put out there by the media. So mainstream media is getting a whole lot of flack for material that they're not actually putting out there. So we need to ensure that there's media literacy and better understanding by consumers of what they're actually looking for, going directly to websites. And this is to answer one of the questions there, is don't go through social media, go directly to reliable organisations that have that are resourced, that are very upfront about how they cover these kinds of stories, that they also have policies about accuracy, that they have policies about complaints, that they have codes of conduct. Be very, very clear about where your information is coming from, because as Rawen showed us, there was so much that has been out there that has been peddled by bad faith actors that are muddying the waters. There's no doubt there have been issues with coverage. And Martin, just interrupt me, I forgot to turn my timer on. So on top of, you know, and mistakes have been made, but, you know, we need to understand staffing issues are a major problem as well. We're not nearly as well staffed in newsrooms as they used to be. Organisations have to turn off the comments, and that seemed to be censoring freedom of speech or people being able to have their view. But so much of the coverage that has to be moderated is abusive, it's threatening, it's violent. So, you know, there's particularly for women and particularly for people of colour. So it's hugely destructive to see those kinds of pylons. Organisations are very, very frightened about getting things wrong, and sometimes are probably hiding behind that and perhaps pulling their punches somewhat. But I think what we need to see more of is organisations and consumers, news consumers, demanding that organisations are upfront and transparent about how they are covering things and why they are covering things. We've seen The Guardian quite openly say, this is what we're doing and why. It's good to see Justin Stevens, the ABC News head today, say that they're setting up an internal advisory board to monitor what's going on. This is really, really important. And I think the other real concern, and we're seeing it reflected day in, day out, is the lack of diversity in our media. We are still a very white, very male, very Christian industry, despite the fact that that is not what our broader community looks like. And the media sector has been extraordinarily reluctant to meaningfully engage in diversity and inclusion projects, or just to actually support diverse staff. We hear that complaint again and again and again. So I would just sort of say that the industry is fighting a lot of fires on a lot of fronts, and this is the latest. I ask that you use your civic responsibility, that when you see or fear code of ethics complaints, or you see bad reporting, that you tell the news organisation, that you don't pile on the journalist in a personal way, but that you make constructive, detailed complaints to news organisations, to the Australian Press Council, to ACMA, the broadcast regulator, to the ABC Ombudsman, or the Guardian Complaint Service, is to actually utilise your skills as a civilian and somebody in civil society to make the kind of complaints to make it better. Because if it's only a social media pile-on, it's very easily dismissed as people just being keyboard warriors. So I could go on and on and on, I won't, but I want to hear the others as well. But I do thank you so much for the opportunity. I also think this is a really important discussion to be having, so I applaud you for hosting this event. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Some really, really interesting points there. We might just go to a couple of the questions from the audience. And I just want to address, Jeff Blake is asking about empirical evidence of there being a pro-Israeli bias in mainstream media. I think, Jeff, I mean, there are different ways of measuring this, but I mean, if you look at the prominence of stories, for example, in our major newspapers, it's one way of gauging how much prominence is given to one side and how much is given to the other, in terms of, say, the Australian newspaper, the Daily Telegraph newspaper. I don't think either of them have had the humanitarian story of Gaza on the front page of any paper since October 7. And the Australian certainly has had a lot of stories about this conflict, but they've all been about strategy. There have been stories that have legitimised the response of Israel. So I think there are ways of quantifying some of those claims of bias, but there are different ways of doing it. I noticed Wendy Bacon has her hand up. I assume that's Wendy Bacon, the journalist. I don't know, James, if you can give Wendy the option of speaking. There's also a question as well. Karen, you might be able to answer this. I want to do a story on Palestine, mainly someone who has family affected in Gaza, but I'm worried that I would face strong backlash and lose my job. Now, we know of some people who have lost their jobs for voicing opinions about the current conflict. What would you say to that, Karen?
Well, that doesn't sound like it's an opinion. That sounds like it's a story. And if you're in a news organisation, we're in the business of stories. I guess it depends a little on, who else is covering it. That I don't know anything about the circumstances of the news organisation at hand. But pitching a story is really important. Is there a mentor in your workplace that you can work with to try and assist you with that and find the best way forward? Editors are in difficult scenarios. They've got a lot of different, they're all juggling a lot of different balls, and it's not often that I will defend managing editors as such, but not every story is actually going to be worth a story. So ensure that it stacks up, that it's not something that's been done before, and what is the point of that story? Is it what is it going to be? Because there's a lot of coverage already that's happened. Is it just going to be seen as something that has already been covered? But pitching a story about a family in Gaza is not a sackable offence or anything like that. So if you're concerned about being that your job is under threat for a story, then you need to get in touch with your union. Join it first if you're not a member, but get in touch with your union. I'd be happy to furnish any calls should that be necessary. Martin and others have my contacts. I'm also open messages on Twitter and LinkedIn and the like, so you can contact me in many ways.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Look, and we saw that meeting at the ABC during the week as well, where journalists, over 200 journalists were involved in that meeting. And one of the things that they said is a number of them said that they didn't feel confident putting forward stories, that they felt that they'd be dismissed, and they didn't really feel they had a voice. Interestingly, too, following that story, there were numerous attacks on the journalists in the ABC for having that meeting. Rawen, I might ask you this question, and James, I don't know if you could flag up a couple of those key audience questions, but in terms of the language used, Rawen, we've seen the media has been quite happy to report on accusations of war crimes, of ethnic cleansing, even of genocide leveled against Russia in its war in Ukraine, and we've had the UN Secretary General come out this week and talk about the potential of genocide in Gaza. Why is it that the media is so reticent about using these sort of terms for this conflict?
Thanks a lot, Martin, for this question. It's a historical context that those words are not used. The ethnic cleansing started in Palestine many, many years ago. Even we track the first ethnic cleansing to 1911. This means way beyond, 1948, when 60,000 Palestinians were kicked out of lands. And so there was the biggest ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948, and even still in the media, they don't call it ethnic cleansing. And I think some Israeli historians, like Professor Ilan Pape at Exeter University, or Israeli journalists like Gidon Levy in Haaretz, are using these words. Still, American, British, Australian, English-speaking are hesitant to use genocide and ethnic cleansing. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you just go to collective punishment and see exactly what is the definition, and if you go to UN ethnic cleansing definition and go into kicking those people, not allowing them to come back, and deleting and removing all their history in the place, it is. We at Arij chose to go into a hashtag called ongoing Nakba, because we do believe it's an ongoing thing. We do believe it's part of a larger ethnic cleansing that is happening. And only in the occupied West Bank, with attacking 4 different Palestinian refugees just 2 days ago, it's also part of this continuous ethnic cleansing that started in many, many years ago and is continuing on individual levels sometimes and on a larger level sometimes. But I do want to acknowledge what Karen said about the newsrooms. I've been in touch with American newsrooms, small and big, regional newspapers, TVs, radios, and they are facing the same dilemma. Inside the newsrooms, it's a big, big conflict there. Editor-in-chief are very reluctant due to slaps and legal threats they are facing or they are afraid to face. And there is really a new generation in the newsroom that thinks differently. And I think it's good to address this and acknowledge that inside the newsroom, journalists are discussing what we are discussing. And I was surprised that it is a much larger than I thought in the States, to the extent that editors, chief editors, head of organization, owners of the media are saying that 50% of their people are not happy of their own coverage. and they are shocked. I think this is the first time something like this is happening in the States, and that's because people are now getting the news directly from people inside Gaza Strip. Even if international correspondents are not able to access, there are videos coming from citizen journalists and revealing what's happening on the ground.
Okay, thank you, Rawen.
Martin, just quickly,
Yep.
it's James here. I've been entering questions into the chat, so all of those questions that have been put are in the chat. For
Okay. I don't know if I was Wendy. I know you got your hand up. Are you able to just put a question in the Q&A? Okay. There's a question here. How do we combat fake human rights experts being interviewed in Australian media? Has an example of somebody who was had worked as a counter-terrorism expert with the IDF. I suppose this also goes to other questions we've had in other stories where there was a conflict of interest in the people that are being interviewed that is not being revealed. Does anybody want to have a crack at that one?
I can quickly. I just want to refer the person who asked the question to the same problem we had during the pandemic. So, and again, research have shown us that there's the idea of using experts, and who is the expert? Have they verified their credentials? On what basis? And in some cases with journalists, it just had been a case of like, we need someone now, and that's the person that is available for us. So let's put them on air without actually making sure that this person has the credentials of the expertise that they are claiming. And there's lots of incidents where mainly this happens mostly with American experts, that you have plenty of them. So there's always this tendency for people to present themselves as experts, and in many cases journalists fall for that.
Okay. There's a question here about how the Jewish...
Karen wants to also comment on this.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thanks, Zahera. I think Zahera is absolutely right. So often it's that quick, dirty, you need something. But again, there still needs to be some verification. That is one of the most basic role of a journalist, is to verify, is to ensure that the person you're speaking to has the kinds of credentials that you say, not just are constantly quoted on those. I think we saw in the same-sex marriage debate, and also in the voice referendum debate, a whole lot of people who were rolled out again and again and again because they were quick and easy. So we need to dispel newsrooms that this is the best way to go. One of the things that booking producers could do, for example, is if there's a page that they send to those people to sort of say, you need to declare, here's our conflict of interest policy. We are, this organisation, and these are our values. You need to declare any political affiliations. Have you run for office? What are the study trips you've got? What are your, it doesn't have to be terribly onerous. Could be a 10 question flick, and then you've at least got somewhere to go to. I just think that in this day and age, we have to check again. And the mainstream media in particular has an obligation to do this because that trust, the lack of trust, the eroding trust between journalists, media organisations and their audiences is ultimately going to send us into a death knell unless we start doing something about it. So some of these additional checks and balances, what you'll often see is the way it goes about is that an organisation, a program will advertise their guest for tonight's show or next week's show, and somebody gets online and says that's a very effective way of actually doing checks and balances, is people saying, no, that person's not who they say they are, and then alerting the news organisations. So I think that it's very, very important that news organisations take that very seriously, that this quick and dirty kind of get things to air, fast and first it doesn't matter if it's not accurate. That takes me back to my very early journalism days. It's first, fast, but accurate. If it's not accurate, if in doubt, leave it out. So let's get back to some basics in journalism, and please can we have the code of ethics back up in every newsroom in Australia, because we've had pushback from news editors, managing editors and owners who don't think that the code of ethics should be hanging in their newsrooms. It's shameful.
Yeah, thanks very much, Karen. sorry, Wendy, would you be able to just put your question in the chat first before we go to you? I might pose this question to Antony. Somebody is asking about the impact of the Israeli lobby on the media, and somebody else also asked about Israeli study tours that take journalists to Israel and what impact that has, and whether these are things that journalists should be declaring as well when they are, involved in writing a story about issues that could be influenced by that.
I've been writing about the influence of Israel lobby trips for 20 years. So sadly, I feel like the issues that were relevant 20 years ago are still just as relevant. What a lot of people maybe don't know is that a sizable percentage of Australian journalists and politicians go on free Israel lobby trips to Israel every year. There was a short break over COVID because of the border closures, but that's been going on for years. And what do those trips mean? They are all expenses paid. You stay at lovely hotels. You spend your whole time in Israel, about 20 seconds in Palestine. And this also happens in the US and the UK as well. It's just not here. And it seems to me that although very few, I think SBS does not do this and ABC doesn't either, but there are journalists across every other mainstream media organization that sends their journalists to me. And I think the trips are ethically deeply problematic personally. But if you do go, and I'd recommend that you don't, but if you do, the idea that a news organization would not mention that vital detail in the bottom of the story is completely unethical. I mean, it's just a no-brainer, A. And B, if you go over there on these trips, you think maybe you can use your own initiative and spend more than 5 minutes in Palestine? Not that difficult to do. And I think ultimately there's no doubt that there is a Palestine lobby, to be sure. It doesn't have the same resources or influence as the Israel lobby does. And I think, unfortunately, what is too rarely done, which I was going to say in my comments a bit later, is too many in the media don't actually question the agenda publicly of the organizations that are sending them. I'm talking about the New South Wales Jewish Border Deputies, AJAC, the two larger pro-Israel groups in the country, are hardline, far-right, pro-occupation organizations, which to me seems unbelievably removed from any kind of fair and accurate reporting of this conflict. So I think journalists take the trips because they're free. Let's be frank. But I think ultimately the impact on the journalism has been devastating, and on politicians, who rarely, by the way, talk about those trips publicly or write about them. And journalists often are the same. And it's pretty easy to see why.
Okay, thank you, Antony. There's a question from Ruby Craner. Ruby says, as a journalist, I take the responsibility of factual and non-biased reporting extremely seriously. However, as a Jew, I find the rising and violent anti-Semitism to be of serious concern to my work and mental health. What advice can the panelists give for Jewish journalists, regardless of their own views on the conflict reporting at this time? Would anybody like to answer that? I mean, this is a serious triggering kind of aspect for many Jews in Australia and elsewhere.
I can jump into this, So Martin, you are muted.
Sorry, I was just saying, okay, go.
Yeah, I just say it's a serious thing, and we need all to combat anti-Semitic, and there has been very courageous Jewish journalist who has been speaking against, anti-discrimination and anti-Semitic and opposition to apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And some of them are Jews, Israelis who live inside Israel. Of course, we all need to take care of our mental health at this stage. Not only, how to deal with anti-Semitic, but also how to deal with all the images that we have been all seeing. It's a mass mental health that all journalists and fact-checkers need to take care of. I think we cannot all afford, psychologists, mental health supporters and experts at this stage. So we need something like a first aid mental health for all of us. We have been following the news 24/7, and this is a serious issue. And also Christians, Muslims, everyone around need to support Jews who are speaking truth into this. We have faced, dehumanizing of Palestinians, also, anti-Islamic things with September 11th. There was hate speech against Muslims in the States that we supported our colleagues there dealing with that. So it's a time where we all need to stand together and work together. That's the only way forward.
Thank you, Rawen. Karen, you wanted to comment too?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think Australian newsrooms and the Australian media sector has a pretty poor reputation for cultural safety more generally, whether that's to our Jewish colleagues or our Muslim colleagues, our First Nations colleagues, any COLD colleagues, to be frank. And that's something we really need to work on. Ruby, please do look after your mental health, and taking a break, walking away is the most important thing you can do. And it's okay to be happy and go and do the things that you love despite what's going on around you. In fact, it's imperative that you do so. I have, for example, an album on my phone of the places and people that make me happy. And when I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, I go there and I look at those places and I look at those people, and sometimes I pick up the phone and sometimes I put on music that makes me sad, and sometimes I put on Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. But you need to do anything and everything you can to look after yourself, because that is the most important thing. These are the darkest and most difficult of times. These stories are very, very difficult. We, I think, going through a bit of a watershed moment perhaps in our industry, and realising where the biases are and our failure to address media concentration, having a really vibrant, sustainable industry for all. Our industry does not reflect our community. It is steeped in racism. It is steeped in sexism. So please, Ruby, and anybody out there who is feeling overwhelmed, understand that it is okay to look after yourself. It is imperative that you look after yourself. My my latest guilty pleasure is something called Layla the Boxer. Their TikToks, they're fantastic. It's two dogs and the hijinks they get up to when their parents aren't around. They will make you happy, and it is the kind of thing that you need to have a pressure release in your life as a journalist and as somebody in these affected communities, because I totally understand that it's a very difficult time for so many of our colleagues right now.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Look, we might, I don't know if James, you can allow Wendy to pose a...
not to pose a question. No.
To answer a question, I think.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, if I may, Martin, just ask you to open up the chat on your screen, and you'll be able to see the questions I've entered in there, which still we can answer maybe in the Q&A towards the end of this session.
Yep.
I'd suggest we're also almost 4:15. I'd suggest we hear from.
You need to move on. Yes. Okay. Look, I just want to ask one last question, just of Zahera, because I think Zahera has to go, as the time is so off the charts over there. Zahera, we're often told that this is too complicated an issue to properly resolve. I mean, is it too complicated? Is it not just a matter of observing law?
It can get complicated because you really need to educate yourself. Okay, so I don't want to undermine the fact that it is a long history of occupation, but there are certain things that journalists can actually do, and just name the names. So one of the studies that I mentioned, they did focus groups with audiences, and mainly young audiences. That was basically in 2011. And one of the things that came out of that is that audiences often relate to the idea or to the word occupation as if someone is occupying a toilet. So they did not realize that it was Israeli military occupation in the West Bank. They thought that the Palestinians are the people who occupy the West Bank. So this is when we realized that it's really important to get the language right. So don't just go into saying something like, the occupation, it is Israeli military occupation, or the settlers. Who are the settlers? They are Israeli settlers. That is illegal under international law. Few words will not actually harm you. It's just really, that's what also we've noticed now, is that journalists who are reporting on this needs to educate themselves. And that's, in most cases, is the issue that we are struggling with when we have, crisis on such a scale.
Okay, thank you. Look, we'll move on to the next speakers, and Wendy, we'll come back to your answer if you can stick around for a bit longer. Right, at this point, I want to introduce the three other speakers. We have Monica Attard with us, the co-director of the Centre for Media Transition. We have Antony Loewenstein, who's an investigative journalist, author, and co-founder of the investigative website Declassified Australia. And we've got Amy McQuire, Dr. Amy McQuire, who's an Indigenous academic whose work is focused on the practice and impact of silencing of marginalised groups. So I'll get each of them to outline what they feel about what's happening at the moment. I'm going to start with Monica. Monica is the co-director for the Centre of Media Transition here at UTS. She's perhaps best known for hosting some of ABC's flagship programs over the years, including PM, The World Today, and Media Watch. She spent 28 years at the ABC, working in radio and television, and won 5 Walkley Awards in the process. She was the ABC's foreign correspondent in Russia for 4 years. And in 1991, when hardliners tried to topple Mikhail Gorbachev in a coup in the middle of the night, reported from the streets of Moscow in her pajamas astride a tank. No pajamas today, Monica.
No, Martin, there aren't. Okay, so look, thank you for having me here today, and it's been really interesting to hear Zahera and Rawen and Karen. Karen, I think we might be crossing over a little bit in what I have to say. Covering conflict is a really, really tough gig. It's probably the toughest gig that there is for any journalist, physically, ethically, emotionally. This particular conflict is confronting, it's long-running, it's painful, it's solution-resistant, it's a terrible tragedy. It's one that's made, I think, journalists redefine what complex actually means. It's forced them to confront their own assumptions about history's reckoning. I think it's made them think about what their audiences are seeing and how prepared their audiences are to tolerate various levels of violence. But this conflict is even more complex because of another array of pressures that reporters are facing. Karen outlined some of them. There's manipulated imagery, there's powerful propaganda machines, there's social media where propagandists can influence and manipulate sentiment. There's this 24/7 information environment, and of course there are these financially pressured media organisations, which is none of which is meant to excuse poor journalism, but just to explain how easy it is for journalists to succumb to easy frames of reporting. And often to publish unverified information and to accept that propaganda can be, for them that they can accept propaganda as real information. And I think actually for some media, and even including in Australia, that almost has become a new business model. So framing and verification, I think, are really important issues here, particularly in times of conflict. They're very, very particular problems. They're age old, but it's always easier to reach out for the loudest narrative, the one that's the easiest to present and explain. In this particular conflict, there are so many frames that have been, rolled out that we've seen. There's that Hamas is this barbaric organisation which hides behind a civilian population of Gaza and is widely committed to the elimination of Israel. That's a very, very powerful frame. There's the frame that the policies of the Netanyahu government in relation to the settlements in the West Bank and the security operations in and around Gaza did not contribute to the environment which led to October 7. There's the frame that Israel has no right to defend itself or even exist, which of course borders on anti-Semitic and persists despite the fact that it's contrary to the positions of the international community. But framing works in a way where it just repeats and repeats and repeats a preferred narrative, and it makes sure that all information is filtered through and is consistent with that frame. And so that all alternative frames are denigrated or deemed to be unverified and non-factual. Language, I think, is another problem in this particular conflict. We have heard the words occupation, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing thrown about an awful lot. Genocide is a legal concept. It's used to describe a deliberate campaign to eliminate a nation or group. I think it's something that international bodies and courts need to decide when it has occurred, and ultimately whether what we're seeing now in Gaza is genocide is something that will come down the track. I don't think it's journalism's role to decide, to make those judgments about intentionality. I think that's a very great burden to place on journalists. I think that journalists can give deliver very cogent reporting on violations of international law, and they have been doing that. I think that they've given prominence to those violations as well, which in a sense is influencing the conduct of the war. I think anything beyond that is actually bordering advocacy journalism, and I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful. Advocacy relies on refusing to look at the whole picture. It excludes some information for verification. It allows people to arrive at a really safely arrive at a predetermined truth based on what the reporter thinks is the truth. And I think that in this particular situation, that's very, very dangerous. Then there's the issue of verification. Now, I think both sides are going to assert that certain people shouldn't be interviewed, that they are incapable of telling the truth. I think deplatforming in this particular situation is also a very dangerous position to adopt. Talking to people, interviewing people with whom you don't agree doesn't necessarily mean that you're acknowledging their truth. It doesn't mean that you're believing them. It means that you're challenging what they've got to say. And I think that we need to hear from people in the various camps, and we do need to challenge them. Look, basically, has Australian media done a decent job of reporting the conflict? Well, I think reporters and their editors and their executive producers need to be alert to the loose language that we've seen used. Media organisations need to walk the walk on diversity too. Karen's talked about that. I don't think it's enough to employ people of diverse backgrounds if you're not prepared to incorporate their lived experience into your editorial policies. Framing, I think, is always problematic. It needs to be de-simplified. It might help if media organisations send really experienced journalists to cover this particular conflict, reporters with history and context in their toolkit. And finally, I think, it's really important to have reporters who can see the tragedy in both its immediate and historical context, who recognise propaganda for when they see it, but reporters who see that this is a tragedy on both sides. It's not just a Palestinian tragedy; it's also a tragedy for the Jewish state. And to have that context, that historical context, I think is extremely important.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Thank you for that. It is one of the most extreme ongoing tragedies we probably have at the moment. So thank you for those comments. I'm going to go to Amy next. Thank you for being here, Amy. Just to introduce Amy McQuire is a Durham Bull and South Sea Islander journalist. She's currently completing a PhD into media representations and violence against Aboriginal women. Amy formerly was the editor of the NIT and Tracker magazine and a political correspondent for NITV National, as well as a senior reporter for New Matilda. She also worked for BuzzFeed here in Australia. And Amy believes there is a connection between the plight of Australia's Indigenous people and the Palestinians. Amy?
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to acknowledge the lands I'm speaking from today, which is the Yagara people. And for our international guests, there's been a long history of Aboriginal solidarity with Palestine. And there's a reason for that, is because basically what I heard from, a prominent Aboriginal poet, Lorna Munro, yesterday, she said it so succinctly. It's the same story, and it's the story of settler colonialism. And I've prepared a little bit something that I've read before today, but I really had to push back a little bit on what Karen and to an extent Monica said. I don't think it's a reality of the industry being, the current reality of the industry, because the reality is that there's been a concerted effort to silence both Indigenous voices over here and to silence Palestinian voices. And that hasn't just started from October 7th. That has been decades and decades. There's no real tyranny of distance, because the settler colonial societies, and Antony will speak to this as well, his work talks about surveillance technologies being used in Gaza and being shipped around the world, and that has impacted us as Aboriginal people. So there are local angles to this, and there are reasons that media should be reporting on this. Last week, we had a protest, tens of thousands of people in Brisbane go directly to ABC South Bank. So what you're talking about here is not what the public is talking about with what they're seeing in media coverage. ABC could have walked out and talked about those protests, because those protests are about pressuring the Australian government. There are local angles that we need to talk about. So I don't think there's any tyranny of distance. I think this is a fact of silencing, deliberate silencing of Palestinian voices who are an Indigenous people. So just to talk a little bit about silencing, when I speak of silencing, I don't speak of the fact that Indigenous people, both Palestinian and Aboriginal, are voiceless. As we know, Palestinian people have been speaking for decades about the truth of their lived experience, as have our own people over here. When I speak of silencing, I speak of it as the discourse, which is the more acceptable discourse that displaces the less acceptable discourse, which is the language of the oppressed. So that's the discourse you will not see. This acceptable discourse is operationalized against us, so that when we speak, our voices become too radical or biased or untruthful, so they go unheard unless we become legitimized by colonizer voices and authoritative voices, those who are always perpetrating the violence. So it's used to both make invisible or shockingly visible colonial violence. That's what we're seeing in Palestine right now. But also to turn it around and say the oppressed become the violent ones. It's only the violence of the oppressed that becomes visible. This might be a little bit controversial, but there's a common question that has been asked repeatedly of every Palestinian in the media and always in the Australian media, and that's, do you condemn Hamas? And that question has a certain function, and it is used to put an ultimatum to Palestinian people in Australia and overseas that you can have a voice, but it's always a conditional voice. It's a conditional on whether you speak within the parameters of the discourse that has already silenced you. And it also does something else. It says something about the nature of Palestinian resistance and suggests that Palestinians do not have a right to resist, which by proxy suggests that Palestinians do not have a right to speak at all about the reality of the occupation. So this is the language that Palestinians use. When we talk about genocide, when we talk about occupation, when we talk about siege, when we talk about liberation from the river to the sea, that's the language of the Palestinians that is being weaponized against them. So they can't talk about this unless they first condemn Hamas. And if they don't, everything else they say afterwards is silenced or deemed too radical or even untruthful. But I wanted to include a word on resistance through my own lens, which is the lens of Aboriginal people here, or what I call Black witnesses. So for our international guests, we have had countless Black deaths in custodies. And I should just say that one of our death in custodies was in the backseat of a G4S van over in Western Australia, Mr. Ward. There's links there. But there's only one case which I think resulted in wall-to-wall media coverage, and that's the coverage that every Black deaf should deserve. That was Palm Island in the death in custody of Mulrunji Doomadgee. Mulrunji's death was not an aberration. There were many Black men who had been bashed to death by police officers. But what made this different, what resulted in media coverage, was resistance. It was the Black resistance, but that Black resistance was framed as violent. Now, this was one case where I could say there were some good examples of journalists stepping up for Black people. They were advocacy journalists. They were unveiling the truth about what the QPS had done and the lies of the QPS to bring the truth about Mulrunji's death to light. But regardless of the coverage, even in those same newspapers who were fighting for the truth, there was one event involved in the case in the media that they utterly failed. And that was the uprising. That was the Palm Islander resistance. So what this suggests to me is that the media may sometimes be equipped to understand the violence and understand the victims, but they never ever understand the resistance. Because to understand the resistance, you have to name the perpetrator. And in Australia, they're using passive language and there's an outright refusal to name Israel as a perpetrator of violence currently being perpetrated in Gaza. And it's violence we're all seeing right now. Because to understand the resistance would be to understand settler colonialism, for which mainstream media is intimately entwined with the state in this country. And that's why I say it's not just a new issue. The history of print media and imperialism and colonialism is intertwined from the very beginning. Imperialism and colonialism could not happen on the scale that it did without the acquiescence of the media, the print media, to bring those messages back to the public, but also to paint Indigenous people in a certain way. So this brings me to sort of the end. The acceptable discourse which silences the voices of the oppressed rests on the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples in Palestine and here in this place. A genocide cannot be perpetrated without first putting in place dehumanizing regimes of representation that see Palestinians as not people, but as less than people, as human animals, as terrorists, as unworthy and as ungrievable lives. Because where else could you see 10,000 deaths in a month and they be seen as ungrievable? Where we're having these debates even now, a month after, where we know the media is heavily complicit. That's because of dehumanization of a people. So Palestinians have a right to live free and they have a right to liberation. That's not what we're seeing. There's all these debates, semantical debates, but that's at the heart of the issue. Silencing is insidious because not only does it cement the status of the other as unworthy of grief and as bodies marked for destruction, but it also refuses to acknowledge the imaginings that Palestinians have for their future. And it will see this future only through the prism of the destruction of another people. That's not what Palestinians are calling for. They're calling for their own liberation. And how does that get construed with the destruction of the Jewish state and the Jewish people? It's that they're not linked at all. So the Palestinians should also not be denied their right to a just future. I also want to talk about these ideas, these journalistic notions of objectivity and impartiality. They only serve the powerful. And I say this as an Aboriginal person. We don't claim to be objective. We don't claim to be unbiased because we know we aren't. To be objective is to side with those in power, those of the dominant discourses, and that only lets us down. And I think when I talk about dehumanization, I can go no further than the way the ABC has treated one of their journalists in Gaza who was filing to them in Gaza, who recently was killed by Israel. There was barely any mention, and Palestinians and journalists themselves had to come outside the ABC and actually raise their voices in protest to say, you have to talk about this. One of your own journalists, one of your own people filing to you was just killed and you haven't mentioned them at all. I think that's all I had to say, but yeah, I just think this isn't just an issue of from October 7th to now. I feel the things we're talking about now are almost far too late. And I feel deeply complicit as a journalist, even outside mainstream media. I think we're all complicit as journalists in what's currently happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was very succinctly put. I think, you know, one of the reasons we're having this conversation now, and we've organised this as quickly as we could too, because the situation is so bad over there, is that we also feel this complicity. And I think people who are protesting, you know, it's a sign that, you know, they're not being heard any other way. I think it's also interesting too, but what you said about those relationships between the Indigenous experience and the Palestinian experience. We've seen this a lot with people who speak up in the Indigenous community when they, you know, speak up out of their area. We saw this with Adam Goodes, the response to him calling out racism. So there are a lot of similarities there. It's also interesting too that as an empathetic people, you know, the Indigenous people were one of the few supporters of Jews during Crystal Night when Bill Cooper, you know, organised his petition. So thank you very much for that, Amy. We will come back with some questions. I want to just bring in our last speaker, Antony. Antony's work as a journalist often delves into Australia's relationships, some of them secret, with governments and organisations around the world. He's worked as a journalist here in journalist here in Australia. He's worked in Sudan and in Israel, reporting for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Al Jazeera English. He's also a prominent Jewish critic of Israeli policy, and a reminder that there are many Jews who have protested what's going on. Some of them are the most vocal critics of Israeli policy. His latest book is The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World, which has just been released. Antony?
Thank you, Martin. And I also wanted to start off by acknowledging traditional owners in the land on which I am. I'm here in Sydney on Gadigal land here today. I will keep my comments brief because everyone's heard a lot of talking and you don't need to hear too much of me ranting on, but a few things I want to say. One of the things that's been really revealing in the last month since October 7, and of course I agree with Amy that Israel-Palestine didn't suddenly start on October 7, this goes back many, many years. But what's been quite frustrating in a way, both since October 7, but certainly before, is how so often much of the mainstream media, and I'm talking here not just about the so-called conservative press, News Limited, but also ABC and frankly The Guardian and others, and Fairfax, Channel 9, The Herald and The Age, that basically make a presumption that the loudest, most prominent Jewish voices are the ones that represent the Jewish community. Now, there's roughly, for those who don't know, we have roughly 120,000 Jews in the country. We don't know the exact number. The census is always not seen as that accurate, but about 120,000 Jews. And it's a small community, mostly between Sydney and Melbourne. And there are definitely loud Jewish voices, to be sure. But what's so revealing, and I think too many in the media are unwilling to do this, is to actually question what the agenda is of those Jewish organizations. To me, it's akin to when the media routinely quotes ASPI. ASPI is one of the most prominent pro-war think tanks in the country and very pro-war towards China. But what is rarely said when the media, ABC, Guardian, News Limited and others talk about ASPI, they don't mention the key point. Who funds it? Who backs it? What's the agenda? The agenda of ASPI, as an example, is funded partly by the US government and weapons manufacturers. That seems to me vital to understand the agenda of a think tank. Now, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, you have key lobby groups in Australia representing, so they claim, the Jewish community. Their agenda for years, long before October 7, is very pro-occupation, pro-Israeli government, uncritical towards the brutal pogroms that are happening in Palestine for years. These didn't start on October 7. So my comment to journalists listening is, be critical and questioning of who these organizations are. I'm not saying you should ignore them. They speak for some Jews, and by all means, you have to present their positions out there. But clearly and critically, there are so few questions given. And therefore, I would say there are growing numbers of critical voices, as Martin said, in the Jewish community, both small organizations and individuals. I think too often we don't hear from those because I think the media and journalists have certain lobby groups on speed dial. It's much easier to go to a lobbyist who you've been speaking to for years than actually find potentially another more critical Jewish voice. So I'd say that. And I think there's also something that I think should be said, it's sort of the elephant in the room here when we talk about Israel-Palestine. I think a lot of journalists and frankly people, citizens, humans, we feel uncomfortable about questioning the role of Jewish power. Now, what I mean by that is, I don't mean, and I'm Jewish myself, that we somehow play into anti-Semitic stereotypes. Obviously, I don't think that. But it's important to understand that certain Jewish groups have power. What does that power mean? What does that power represent? And I think for many in the media, they feel very uncomfortable questioning or challenging that power because they don't want to play into, to some extent, understandably, anti-Semitic stereotypes. And I get that. But I'd also say, be critical. Look at the agenda of these organizations, AJAC, Executive Council of Australian Jewry, New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Their positions on Israel-Palestine are all identical. Israel, right or wrong, pro-occupation, no critical voices whatsoever. When Israel has this year the most far-right government in its history, and I've seen that a lot since October 7th, so I just wanted to mention that. You know, there's an interesting article that was published overnight by the owner of the Educational Bookshop, which is a great bookshop in East Jerusalem for those who don't know. And he talks essentially about how there's been an influx of Western journalists coming to Israel essentially since October 7 to report. And he said something which I think is worth saying because it's just as relevant here as it is if you're a journalist based overseas. He talks about a concept I've often said for years, so-called hotel journalism. Now, what hotel journalism is basically journalists who go to place X or Y and barely leave their hotel room. Now, some people listening might say that surely doesn't happen. How is that even conceivable that a journalist would go across the world and barely leave their hotel room? It happens a lot. I've seen it in countless examples around the world, from places in Latin and South America, Afghanistan, and Palestine. It doesn't mean the journalist literally never leaves his or her hotel room. It means that the sources that they're getting are incredibly limited. And what I would say is that we too often are not actually featuring, even when we're here in Australia, journalists who are leaving their hotel room. We have journalists from ABC and others who are on the ground, some doing some fine work, to be sure, but too often we are relying on journalists who don't know the context. And I would argue, and I've said this for many years, that many news organizations deliberately are sending people to Palestine, Israel, who don't know what's going on. That's why they're sending them there. In other words, they want people to be kind of in the dark, naive, clueless. I'm not saying people should be activists. I mean, I have a view that, and I agree with Amy in many ways, that this concept of activism journalism is kind of a misnomer. Every journalist is an activist. The question is that, in my view, on most issues, most journalists are activists in a mainstream pro-government, pro-corporate way. Do we honestly think that the vast majority of journalists in the Canberra Press Gallery are not activist journalists? They're not called that. They wouldn't call themselves that. What do you think most Canberra journalists in the press gallery are doing? They're essentially repeating government press releases and leaks from lobbyists. That's their job. They're activists. They might not call themselves activists, but that's what they are. But somehow, if you're a so-called left-wing journalist or progressive journalist, that makes you an activist, and it's a negative thing. I think being fair is important, to be very clear. And in many issues, there's more than one side. On Israel-Palestine, obviously, there's not just one side. I mean, for example, I've spent many times over the years with the most extreme far-right settlers in the West Bank. Not because I agree with them. Obviously, they're Jewish and they're fundamentally opposed to my worldview. But you have to hear what they're saying. What is their position? Why are they doing this? Why are they settling the land? Why are they colonizing? But at the same time, you would not call someone who spends so much time in a certain position an activist. And I think that is a bit of a misnomer. And just finally, I, as Martin said, I'm the co-founder and co-editor of a group called Declassified Australia, which was founded a few years ago with Peter Cronow, who used to be a Four Corners reporter. And last week, we do stories that are critical of Australia's relations with the world. Essentially, people can find us online easily. And we had a story last week, which I just want to mention in passing because I think it's quite revealing. We had a story that my colleague Peter wrote about Pine Gap. I'm sure everyone knows Pine Gap is the US intelligence base near Alice Springs. It's been here for decades. And what the story essentially showed, and that went viral and global and was read hundreds, if not millions of times, is that the US intelligence base at Pine Gap is providing real live intelligence to the Americans they're passing on to the Israelis to be used in its war fighting in Gaza, which means that the Australian government, Australian officials are directly complicit in what Israel is doing. Now, I mentioned that story because it was published last week. There has been zero, not exaggerating, zero pickup by any other media, ABC, Guardian. Now, I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. Why is that? They didn't want to be beaten to the story. They didn't think it was important. Put your analysis here. Who knows? But to me, it seems pretty revealing that a major story that shows that the key US intelligence base in Australia is being used to assist Israel in its brutal war where Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza seems to me like quite a big story. I did note that someone just messaged me that SBS Arabic did pick it up. So bless SBS Arabic and forgive me for not acknowledging that. I didn't know that. But beyond them, as far as I'm aware, nobody did. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antony. Well, it's a good reason to read Declassified Australia.
It is.
I guess, because you're not going to get it anywhere else.
It is.
You could actually answer this question from one of the audience members, Janine, who asks, if Australian media is not representative the diverse Australian community. And I think this is a a topic that we've talked about for a while now, the lack of diversity within the media, which is slowly improving, but probably too slowly. How do we then look for reliable, unbiased media sources?
Well, there's a few ways. I mean, obviously it depends on the issue, of course, but in terms of Israel-Palestine, what needs to happen is when there's not a so-called crisis, although obviously Israel-Palestine is always a crisis, but it's particularly a crisis in the last month, develop those contacts, build relationships with critical Jewish voices, Palestinian voices, Arab voices. I'm not just talking about Jewish voices here. Obviously, I'm Jewish myself, but a range of voices. That's when the work has to be done, when it's not chaos 24/7. Build those relationships. So when you need to speak to someone, you don't just go on speed dial to the person you've been calling for decades. And one final thing on that, which no one really has mentioned here, which needs to be acknowledged, there is a deep, long history of major Israel lobby bullying of the Australian media, ABC, definitely SBS, and many other outlets. And it's important to acknowledge that, because I've known myself over the years, many journalists and editors and more senior people who don't just necessarily shift their coverage because of that, but they often censor themselves. Self-censorship is rife in this industry. And what I mean by that is that often the judgment is made, it's just, it's much easier not to cover that kind of issue from that perspective, because if I do, I'm going to be slammed for doing so. Now, everyone has a right to lobby. Everyone has a right to lobby, but the difference is bullying. Israel lobbyists routinely try to bully media outlets in covering an issue in a certain way. And I know that that's not a conspiracy theory. That's based on years and years and years of writing and investigating it.
Mark, can I make a comment or two?
Sure.
Yep.
Just in relation to some of the things that have just been said, Amy, I mean, you're saying that you say that Palestinian voices have been silenced. I actually don't see that. I don't see that.
You don't see Palestinian voices being silenced. I could send you to numerous Palestinian writers who have been silenced over the years, including by Schwartz Media. There is a boycott right now of Schwartz Media because they do not publish Palestinian voice. There are so many Palestinian writers who've been continually silenced. And even if you watch the interviews, you will see that playing out. Look at Erin Moylan on the Sky News the other day, talking to Rand Abdel Fattah. Look at anyone. Recently, there was a hit piece on Nasser from the Australian Palestinian Network. You can't say that Palestinians haven't been silenced. I don't accept that at all.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not seeing it in mainstream coverage, not in the same way that you are in any event. And your other point that Israel has not been blamed, it has not been targeted as being the perpetrator of the violence. Really?
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. Like, you see the passive language around Palestinians in Gaza being
specifically named.
No, there's complete absence of the perpetrator in the language. I don't know. Well, I don't know what media you're consuming.
I'm not quite sure what you listen to, but I dispute that. I think that Israel has been very, very, very firmly blamed as being the perpetrator of the violence in Gaza. Who else? And Antony, I mean, one of the things that you said that kind of took me aback was that every journalist is an activist, which I find really surprising. I mean, in all the years that I worked as a journalist, I was never an activist. And I think a lot of our colleagues in the press gallery would be
they'd be offended. I'm sure they'd be offended.
But I think that's the problem with mainstream media. If you don't consider yourself activists or
I'm not saying, Monica, that every day you wake up and your vision was to, be an I mean, choose whatever word you want. All I'm saying is that, to me, the majority of journalists are activists. The problem is that word has become, I guess, loaded about instead of bashing someone over the head with a particular point of view or particular message. As I said, if the majority of mainstream media on a range of issues, not just Palestine, are towing a particular line on an issue, whatever the issue may be, that's activism. That's what activism is. The vast majority of Canberra Press Gallery journalists are repeating press releases from politicians and lobbyists. That's what being in the press gallery means, as it is in London or Washington. That's what most of Canberra journalism is. I'm not saying all of it. I have friends in the Canberra Press Gallery. I'm not saying everyone is like that, to be clear, but that is a form of activism. Being very pro-blindly business in certain ways, that's activism. That's activism.
Yeah,
I think that, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I think certainly what Anthony's talking about there is the drip, the government drip that journalists are on.
And most journalists are on it in Canberra.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Look, James, I think Mohammed Yusuf is there.
Yeah, there's just 10 minutes left. So if there's any particular questions that are in the chat or in the Q&A that panelists want to answer, I think we should try and answer. But also, of course, both Mohammed and Wendy sought to come in to make a comment. So you can call them in now if you like. I'm not sure if they'll be able to hear you. So is Mohammed on?
So, I'm available.
Okay, did you want to say something?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mohammed?
Yes.
Okay, Mohammed is a former UTS student, and I just wanted to bring Mohammed in to explain the pressure on journalists at the moment in terms of talking up about what they're seeing in the coverage. Mohammed, what happened to you?
So thank you to everyone who's spoken, and I'm thanking Martin for this opportunity as well. So basically, what happened to me is I work for one of the main media networks. I used to work for Channel 10, and I did a post on LinkedIn. It was general in nature. So the first thing I stated was at university, we're taught to be unbiased and objective. And I went on to question the framing of the situation in Israel and Palestine and Gaza at the moment. And I asked, are both sides being shown in a fair manner? So the things that I sort of brought up, it was a general post. I didn't criticize my actual network or anything like that. It was a general post around the use of language when it comes to Hamas. The use of language is they're barbaric, they're terrorists, so on and so on and so on. Yet the use of language when it came to Israel annihilating whole entire neighborhoods and killing thousands of people, you don't see the words war crimes, you don't see the word genocide, you don't see any of these words being used. And I think it's interesting that, previously Monica would have said that we have to wait until international organizations claim that this is a genocide or not. If you look up the meaning of the word, you can see that it is a focus on an ethnic group to cleanse and get rid of that group, really. And the use of, human shields as being a reason to bomb an entire neighborhood and an entire group is beyond logical to me. And then I also questioned the humanization of Israel's side and no humanization on the Palestinian side. So what I mean by that, or what I questioned was, you will say, a media organization will say 8,000, Palestinians died, were killed, sorry. And then they would say, they'll have a generic picture of two kids on top of the rubble. And then straight away after that, they will say these two Israeli soldiers, they'll name them, they'll tell you their age, they'll tell you that they were killed, their family is very upset. They'll show you families from the Israeli side crying about their children, their families, their hostages that have been taken. Yet that same media, I don't think it can be questioned, have access to Palestinian stories and Palestinian people. And it's available on many social media outlets that can be used, but they're not using it. And that's something that I question. And then you have the final question that, not the final question, another question that I asked is, another aspect that I looked at was you don't feel the remorse of the Palestinian side when they're just shown as numbers. There's no emotional connection. However, there is an emotional connection to the Israeli side. And then the last thing that I asked was, there's a big questioning of when Palestinians come on the channels, they're questioned about, do they condemn Hamas's actions? Yet when Israelis come onto those same networks, they are not questioned about condemning Israeli government and the IDF's actions of what they are doing. Anyway, that was the post. I'll try to be as quick as possible. I got a call from my manager. The post, he told me, look, we've had a complaint about your post. You take it down or we fire you. I told him, he goes to me, do you see what you've done wrong? I told him, he gave me the social media policy. I told him I don't see what I've done wrong. I don't believe that any of my questioning criticizes Channel 10 as a network. It's a general kind of concept. And basically around that, he was like, it came down to the end where I said, I'm not going to take it down. It ended up being, I got fired because I didn't take it down. And yeah, I think it's very sad that somebody can question what the media is really, when you look at it, doing incorrectly, and then they get fired from their job. And I think I'm not the only person that this has happened to, but it's happened to many. And yeah, unfortunately, that's what's happened, and that's my story. I'll give it back to Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that. Look, I think we're seeing a lot of attacks on journalists who post things. There were, Nahor Haddad was, there was a story written about her social media post recently. There is pressure on anyone who dissents with what the narrative, the general narrative is. Now, James, there was also Wendy Bacon wanted to.
Yes, for sure. If Wendy's still there,
could I just say something?
Speak up. Yeah, go for it, Wendy.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about before when we were driving in the car. Look, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you for holding this seminar today. I think it's really very welcome. I'd also like to very much, just hearing that story about silencing, I'd like to sort of really, as an older journalist, congratulate Mohammed on taking a stand, and I'm really sorry that he's had to pay that penalty. Look, both Amy and Antony talked in their examples to explain some of the ways in which bias is structured into the media. And one of those ways, of course, is silencing. You have absences as well as you have presences. And so that's very important. But I want to go back to a question that was asked much earlier about can we get empirical evidence of bias, and also to, I guess, disagree with Karen when she says that we're just beginning to think about bias and we don't have these discussions about craft in Australia, because in my experience, we have had them, and today is another example of it, but we've had many in the past. Now, there are endless studies in Australia, and there's various ways you can look at bias in the media, but there are endless ones. There's whole books on how the media has reflected Islamophobia and reported on the Middle East. There are large-scale studies on how climate change has been covered in the most extremely biased way in the Australian media by the dominant organisation of News Corp, and inadequately covered in earlier years by the ABC and Fairfax as well. There's more recent research coming out on the extreme structural bias around the reporting on the Voice. That's also in relation to News Corp. Now, while I agree with Antony that there are problems at the ABC and Fairfax as well, you can't really talk about the Australian media without talking about News Corp. Now, News Corp is an advocacy organisation. It's not just that its journalists are activists, it is actually advocating certain positions. So, whether we use the word activist or advocate, it's certainly true that bias is structured, meaning is structured into the media. We can do a study on how this current conflict has been covered, but I think we can observe it for ourselves as well. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Wendy. We really only have time for probably a couple more questions. Just going through them. James, is there anyone in particular that you want to have answered there that's come up?
Some of these questions, well, most of the questions have gone, I think, have gone to the panelists. So if there's anything that the panelists... We
will try to answer these questions later. We're going to sort of keep a list of who's put questions, and we will try to get back to you about them.
Can I just make one other point? Just in, I think, I can't remember who said it. It might have been you, Amy, it might have been Antony, I can't remember, but that there was no acknowledgement of the freelance Palestinian journalist who was working for the ABC, who was killed in Gaza. That's actually not true. There was acknowledgement of that both by the ABC and widely on social media by ABC journalists. In fact, I was alerted to it by a tweet from Norman Hermont, who's Karen's husband. And
so from what I understand of that matter, there was a vigil planned and then it came out, and then 7:30 gave a two-sentence response.
It was acknowledged.
That is not enough. That is not enough.
He's a freelance
I don't accept that was enough.
So I think it's wrong to say that there was no acknowledgement of it. There was acknowledgement, and people were quite grief-stricken. I mean, it was awful, and it's awful for people who've worked.
I think if you think about it, if this was
and
a white journalist filing to ABC, would they have received the same response?
Sorry, I missed that.
If this was a white journalist filing to ABC, would they have received the same response?
Oh, I would certainly hope so. Yes.
No, I think they would have received a way better response from the ABC. But that's the real. Can I just say something about diversity in the, like, it's been brought up a few times. There's a lot of talk about diversity as the answer to journalism, but what happens when a lot of Aboriginal or non-white and Muslim journalists go into these structures is that they face the violence of the top and of the silencing within those organizations, which is what Muhammad just spoke about. So diversity is not really the answer. I think the answer is...
No, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I mentioned that at the end of when I was speaking. I mean, I think diversity on its own is not enough. You have to find a way to incorporate those, those experiences, the lived experiences, the viewpoints into editorial policies that can at times be very, very rigid and unable to, to deal with alternative viewpoints. But in any event, look, there are problems all over, and diversity is a very, very big one, and I don't think we're going to solve that in the next couple of years.
Well, diversity needs influence as well. Diversity needs power, otherwise it's tokenistic, and that's probably where we're at mostly in the media at the moment in Australia. There is tokenistic diversity, but it's not diversity with power. Okay, so we're right on time now. I don't know, do we, I think maybe we should just wrap this up. I mean, it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. I hope those of you at home who are watching this have got something out of it. As I said, James and I will try to get back to people who posed questions who didn't get answers. There were just far too many of them. James, do you want to say something?
Only that, yes, we've got the questions, we've got your individual email, and if it's okay, either me or Martin can get back to you. We were able to answer a few, but not all of them, and I really think the debate has been very important between us here as well. So thanks so much for all the panelists for engaging.
Yes, thanks so much. A brilliant sort of points that have been reflected on and done very well. Thank you, all of you.